All right, let's go to the phones. Calling from a 210 area code. Who's this? Where are you calling from?
Good afternoon, Sam. This is John from San Antonio.
John from San Antonio, getting the pole position today. Good for you. How are you doing? Are you ready for Monday night? We'll be in touch. I'll send you send me an email just so that I have it at majorityreporters@gmail.com, and I will we will work out timing for Monday night.
Okay, sounds great. Super psyched. So here's a quote from Bernie. The truth is we can win this election if we have the largest voter turnout in the history of this country. On caucus night, I'm modifying this part of the quote. When you're watching the Majority Report, and if the moderator tells you there's a large voter turnout, we win. The Des Moines Register put out an article on January 7th called What's the Expected Turnout on Caucus Night? Iowa Democrats are using the H word, huge. Here's some excerpts from the article. Turnout will probably rival the 2008 record, which they said was nearly 240,000. The actual estimation was around 236. Which included an unprecedented number of first-time caucus goers. Party officials and volunteers are preparing for a massive turnout. It's the search for larger venues. The party has landed private venues. The party has spent around $20,000 on venues alone in Polk County, the home of Des Moines. We're dealing with caucus sites that will have 1,200 people in them, according to Judy Downs, who's the Polk County Democratic Executive Director. Downs says there are some sites that will have an increase of 300% from 2016. One of the things in Polk County is that when you canvass, you're not necessarily going to be able to caucus at the precinct. You may have to drive a few miles to caucus because that elementary school that you're usually caucus at isn't going to be able to hold the population that needs the caucus. So the turnout for the 2016 Democratic caucus was 1,071,500, and according to Chuck Rocha, one of Bernie's senior advisors, Bernie got 85,000 votes in 2006 and 16 and expects to get that total or higher. The turnout ratio, according to the voter-eligible population of Iowa voters from both Democrats and Republicans, is 15.7%, or about 7.5 for Democrats. So the 11% turnout ratio that I talked about in my last call among voters who are 18 to 29% is expected to triple, according to a Suffolk poll released last Friday.
That's nuts.
So if you can, yeah, I mean, hopefully it's going to happen, you know. So if you compare that to like New Hampshire, you know, they had I think 52%, you know, vote in their primary, which was the highest in the entire country. So I mean, it just shows you, since, you know, even though they expect a record turnout, you can really turn this election just by it's still relatively low turnout compared to regular primaries. So you can turn everything just by turnout. So, you know.
And we should say, if Sanders gets the same amount that he did in 2016, Clinton just beat him by, I know it was like, 2 delegates, I think, right? And so no one else has the relative strength, theoretically. Right? I mean, there'll be the viability is such, like it only goes to the second round in terms of viability, right? Like, I mean, if you maintain viability through the first round and the second round, it's conceivable you could have 3 or 4 people, right, pulling delegates out of there.
Yeah, I mean, that's one thing. In the last 4 days, I think that Buttigieg has moved up 1 point. Warren has moved up above that viability level. I mean, I think when I called it on Monday, she was at 14. Now she's up to 16. So, I mean, you know, it really does, the Iowa caucus really does promote parity compared to most primaries, where, like in New Hampshire, the last poll that came out, everybody besides Bernie was under 15%. So, I mean, I wrote a tweet saying that he could get 100% of the delegates. And, I mean, I don't think that's possible when you look at an average of polls. But, I mean, that's just according to that one last poll. But so anyway, so I'm concerned that that certain venues will not be able to hold all caucus goers because they will reach capacity. So Bernie voters really need to show up extra early so they can be let in before they reach capacity. I've already seen one Iowa caucus goer say on Twitter that her caucus holds 400 and 276 have already RSVPs. So Bernie leads in Iowa hasn't changed dramatically from the last time I called, despite 5 new polls that came out. So I'm looking at the polls that poll the top 4 candidates, which I feel is more accurate because the second vote, which is the one that really determines the delegates. So Bernie's at 25, Biden's at 22. Buttigieg is up 1 point from the last time I called. He's at 18, and Warren's up, like I said earlier, at 16. So Tuesday and Wednesday, you were talking about how people don't vote on ideology, and you even dismissed the analysts who talk about elections in terms of ideological voting. And I would admit that there are many voters who have idiosyncratic views, and many political canvassers will confirm this. So what we're talking about is a certain percentage who vote on issues and those who don't. Right. So you agree with that, okay?
Of course.
So I would say, in broad terms, that people, when you say that people don't vote on ideological views, you're discounting an increasing amount of knowledgeable voters in the electorate, according to many political science studies. I've argued that exit polls show that during the 2016 Democratic caucus and primaries, if you ask voters who consider themselves extremely liberal, Bernie Sanders received the highest amount of votes in every state except for those who were uncompetitive. And the same thing applied to Clinton, winning moderate and conservative voters in every state except those uncompetitive states. So the same applies to this year's election. Bernie wins extremely liberal voters, and Biden wins moderate and conservatives. Even people like pollster Ann Seltzer, who usually don't agree in voting by ideology or lanes, can't deny this is happening in this year's elections. Though I would disagree that I think this is a long-term pattern. I would recommend that you and your audience listen to the podcast called The American Public's Growing Ideological Sophistication, which is a conversation between political science professors Martin Wattenberg of Cal Irvine and Austin Kozlowski from the University of Chicago.
Wait a second. John, you're telling people to listen to a different... Why don't you just say, why not have them on as guests? Don't tell people go listen to a different show. Are you calling into other shows?
I'm sorry?
Are you calling into other shows?
Well, you haven't done the fake jealousy thing for a while, but okay. No, I'm not.
All right, good. Well, let me ask you this: how many people self-identify as extremely liberal in the Democratic primary?
Of extremely liberal self-identify, I don't know offhand. Let me see. I can look it up. 2016. I mean, they're not going to have a national total. I can look in. Well,
my point is that saying that Bernie Sanders wins amongst the extremely liberal. Listen, I'm not discounting that. You and I obviously vote on ideological terms. Everyone I talk to who calls into the show is voting on ideological terms on some level, right? In terms of policy, et cetera, et cetera. So I obviously believe that a certain percentage does. But the ones who are up for grabs at this point, I don't think are. And I think, I mean, there may be other cues that suggest that, but saying that Bernie Sanders wins the most liberal or the most left, however they phrase that, I think, yeah, of course he does. That doesn't mean, that's not the same as saying most voters vote on ideology. It just means the ones that do know who they're voting for. But I'm just suggesting that the majority of people in these elections don't.
Right, but exit polls reflect, a good sample, just like regular polls, of voters. I mean, these aren't
right. Well, that's what I'm asking you.
Voters.
What percentage? It's one thing to say that Bernie wins the extreme, the extremely liberal voters, right? He gets 70% and Biden gets 30%, let's say. But if there's, out of a pool of 100 and there's only 10 who identify that way, it still doesn't address my theory.
28% identified that way in Iowa in
so a quarter of the voters, you're suggesting, who identify as extremely liberal, Bernie won more of those. Well, yeah, okay.
Right, by 19 points. 40% identify as somewhat liberal. Clinton won that by 6, and 28% is by moderate, and she won that by 23%. And that pattern happens all across in practically every state. So, I mean, that's my point.
Okay. All right. Well, I appreciate it. We will talk about Monday. Thank you. Now you have time to go call your other show, John.
I didn't. I don't call it the other shows.
Yeah. All right. Talk to you later. Thanks for the call.
All right. Thank you. Okay. All right.